Well, when you talk about the powers of darkness, you have to devote some attention to Satan. Let's talk about Satan. Most people, when they think of Satan, they will think of Genesis 3, or they'll think of Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, what scholars call the prologue of the book of Job. So we have a meeting, a divine council meeting. The sons of God are assembled, and then in English Bibles, Satan, capital S, shows up. There's a confrontation there. And that launches us into what happens to Job. So what we have in Job 1 and 2 is we have a member of the spiritual world, in this case sort of a functioning member of a board meeting. He's not evil and sinister. He's actually doing his job. Satan as a noun means adversary. That's true. It sort of transitions from I'm doing my job to challenging or becoming adversarial in relation to God is when he questions God's assessment of Job. So he's questioning God's omniscience of the situation. He's also questioning God's integrity. Is God telling us the truth about Job? And by the time you get to the New Testament, this is 400 or 500 years later, it has become on its own a proper noun. So you get a figure who's named Satan. So you have capital S Satan running around doing stuff, and the New Testament associates that figure with the serpent of Genesis 3.
In the ancient world, many cultures told stories about a monster of death that lurks in the deep, dark sea.
I guess I just want to make the case that there are dragons all over the Bible. There be dragons.
How did they be dragons?
All over.
When it comes to the world of the powers of darkness, there are certain things that are just on the table. There is disorder or chaos. Those things are 180 degrees removed from the world God created for the human family that he wanted. Leviathan was a very familiar symbol in the ancient world, not just in Israel and Canaan, but just broadly. This great dragon of the sea as being a metaphor for chaos. Ultimately, the ones driving the bus aren't necessarily the human power brokers, because behind the human power brokers, there's a more sinister intelligence that wants to destroy, that wants to enslave, that wants you to worship them. This is why the nations, both in Psalm 82, Revelation, and lots of other passages. I mean, there's tons of passages like this in the Old Testament. This is why the nations are described this way, and why the gods of those nations get looped into it. It's all one huge, chaotic, evil system.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. We believe in the power of the good news and that Jesus has defeated evil and is king of our world. We exist to help you rediscover the supernatural focus of your Bible. We believe that the supernatural focus has been suppressed, and we're here to help bring that back into the light. We do that through incredible content creation. We have mashups and interviews with some of the best scholars featuring N.T. Wright, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, and Dr. Michael Heiser. All of this content creation supports our nonprofit ministry here at Ring Them Bells, where we provide pop-up feeding centers for the homeless and also specialize in hurricane relief. If you haven't yet, please take a second. It only takes a moment for you, but means so much for this ministry. Subscribe and turn on the alerts, as this is the best way to connect with our channel. Starting at the very beginning in Genesis and tracing all the way through Revelation, we are going to explore the theme of the Chaos Dragon. The theme of the Chaos Dragon is going to take us into the divine council worldview and the supernatural narrative that Jesus put flesh on. As always, when exploring important themes throughout the Bible, it is important to start at the beginning. Buckle up and get ready for an incredible episode and series. Stay tuned, my friends. The beginning is near.
Jesus described his healing ministry as breaking into the house of a highway bandit that had robbed all of this plunder from people, and he's here to get back what belongs to God. Are you with me? When Jesus saw that woman, this is in the Gospel of Luke, and her back was malformed and she had been bent over for 18 years, and what he said is, man, this woman has been enslaved to the snake for 18 years. It ends today. When Jesus saw his suffering world, the one that he was angry at was that hostile one who's responsible. And all of the roads of cause and effect of human evil and suffering within the biblical story all lead back to the moment that humans believed the lie. And we've been believing the lie ever since. And that's the one that Jesus is angry at. And so when we read the book of Job, the one that all of our frustration and angst and anger ought to be directed at is Hasatan. Are you with me? And God, in his mysterious purpose and mercy, has raised up a righteous servant who will go into suffering and emerge victorious out the other side. And that's exactly the story of Jesus. That's the story that Jesus saw himself fulfilling.
Now we're going to move into a scroll called Job.
Yeah. Well, hold on. Before we do that,
Sure.
so fundamental to the biblical story, though, is that God plants within creation an outpost of garden order and the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And he installs heavenly and earthly rulers as his partners in the creation project to
Continue to subdue.
turn that
chaos.
outpost into something that spreads and fills all creation.
Mm-hmm.
But through the agency and decisions and wisdom and rulership of the creatures themselves, trusting God's wisdom.
Yeah.
But when they choose to do what's good in their own eyes, they end up undoing God's good order and so become agents of that dragon chaos. And so then both heavenly rulers in rebellion against God and earthly human rulers in rebellion against God can be described with the symbolism of the dragon. So that's kind of the big framework for where we're going.
Right. And that makes it complicated that when the Bible's talking about the dragon, what's it talking about? Is it talking about simply that there's disorder in the world that God wants to order and wants us to partake with him in ordering? Or is it talking about the rebellion of God's image bearers working to create violence and disorder? So is it talking merely about the creatures and the sea and the wilderness and expanding the garden? Or is it talking about like Babylon coming to destroy us? And I guess I'm wondering in the case of Job, because we're going to meet the dragon here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Job is a story about a man who suffers greatly and wants to know what's going on. Why am I suffering?
Yeah.
So he's experiencing chaos in his life.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, the book of Job is going to be an exploration about what it looks like to live as one of those human image of God rulers on the land. And then when, as a human ruler, you've been living by God's word and wisdom, right? And in the fear of the Lord. And in theory, if you do that, it should just be Garden of Eden for you. You're just working the garden with God. But then what happens if you live in a creation that's on its way to the full garden ideal, but there's still wilderness out there and oceans with dragons and dangerous things? What happens when the chaos dragon strikes our life in the form of, for Job, it takes a lightning strike, in the form of bandits and raiders who come steal and kill and destroy, and then of a huge storm that knocks a house over that his kids are in, and they all die. What's that about? How is the image of God supposed to process that? And so that's what happens to Job. But that's not just what the story is about. What we are given is a picture of what's happening up in the divine council in the skies between God and some of the host of heaven. So this is how it works. One day, chapter 1, verse 6, the sons of Elohim, spiritual beings, were standing before the Lord, and the opposer, the one opposed, also came with them. It's the Hebrew word the Satan.
Mm-hmm.
Gets translated as a proper name in all of our English translations, which is, I guess, fine, but it doesn't help us really understand what's going on.
Doesn't sound like you think it's fine.
I guess not. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a proper name. You don't put the word the on the beginning of a proper name.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to show you kind of what's lurking behind this. If you read, again, the thing on Facebook or YouTube, and it'll say something like, hey, not only is Satan not in Genesis 3, but in Job 1 and 2, it should be translated the Satan or the adversary, the accuser. It's not this figure from Genesis 3. And so there's no such thing as the devil. The Bible has, you're making all this up. Okay, those are terrible and flawed conclusions drawn from something that is real in the text. And so I want to unpack this for you. Now, to summarize what we have in Unseen Realm, I want to show you, again, visually how this works. It is true that in Job 1 and 2 and in Zechariah 3, the footnote is there for a reason. Hebrew, the adversary, the accuser. That's because in Hebrew, we have the word Satan prefixed with a definite article, a little particle that is essentially the word the. So literally it's the Satan, ha-Satan. Hebrew is like English in this respect. English does not tolerate a definite article before a proper personal noun. I'm not the Mike. Okay, my brother is not the Brad. My wife is not the Drina. English just doesn't tolerate that. It's stupid and ridiculous. Hebrew is the same way. Hebrew does not have definite articles before proper personal names. And that means that Satan here is not a personal name. This should not be capital S Satan. So that part of the Facebook, Village Atheist rant is correct. It shouldn't be capital S. It should be just a generic adversary. It's not the figure of Genesis 3. That this character, this figure that we now know by name. That all of that is true, but that what isn't true in the Village Atheist rant is that there's no theology in the Bible about an original rebel. Oh, there is, and that is what Genesis 3 is about. I'm going to run a search here. What I'm going to do to show you this visually is this is a simple search. I'm looking for the Hebrew definite article, one letter, ha, with the noun Satan. That's all we're looking for here. So if we run this search, you say, I don't read Hebrew, Mike, but here's all you need to see. Zechariah 3, see the ha is in red, the article ha-Satan, 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 ha-Satan. Down here in Job 1:6, Job 1:7, Job 1:8, 9, 12, Job 2:1 and 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. Every place that you read in your English Bibles, in Job 1, Job 2, and Zechariah 3, where you have Satan, it's ha-Satan. It is not a personal name. Every one. There are no exceptions. Every time. So that is the issue, again, that we're dealing with.
We need your help. Ring Them Bells is a non-profit organization where every dollar donated goes right back into the mission of spreading the good news and helping those in need. The main ministry of Ring Them Bells is serving those in need in the name of our King Jesus. Over the past year, we have fed over 2,000 meals, and next year, we want to double that. We can't do this without your support. Everything we create here and all of the food that we serve is free because it's paid for by generous viewers just like you. If you feel led to donate and join the mission with us here at Ring Them Bells, click the Give Butter link in the notes and comments of this video. If you can't support us financially, please continue to like and share the content, as this helps us so much with spreading the good news about what Jesus has done for our world.
What we have here in Job 1 and 2 is we have a divine council meeting. That's very clear from the passage, where the sons of God have assembled They're going to meet with God. Again, there's lots of these meetings in the Old Testament. And somebody shows up in the room called Hasatan, the accuser, the adversary. And God asks him, let's just go back here. God asks him, hey, where you been? From where have you come? Satan, Hasatan, the Satan, answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down in it. And then the Lord says to Satan, hey, have you taken a look at Job? Boy, there's nobody like that guy. And then the scene unfolds. Hasatan is actually an office. This is actually a job description. This is a being, and this goes along with the biblical theme of heavenly books, where what we do and the things that happen to us, the Bible says probably in 12, 15 places that these things are recorded. Okay, the book of life is the most familiar one, but there are other books, going on. But Hasatan is essentially an office where this guy goes around and he observes people to see who is living righteously and who isn't. That's his job. So when God asks the Satan, where you been? And he tells him, he's been doing his job. And that's why God asks him, have you caught Job's act? There is nobody like Job. He is blameless and upright. That guy, I love that guy. He's wonderful. He really loves me. He shows me by the way he lives, So that, God is really, enthused about Job. And Satan says, yeah, I've seen that dude. If you took away all he had, it'd be a different story. Now, this is the line that the accuser crosses. He has just challenged God's assessment of Job's character. He's basically said, you don't really know Job like I do. He's saying this to God. If you did this, that, and the other thing, he would curse you to your face. So a challenge has gone out from the Satan, Hasatan, to God. He has overstepped his bounds. He is out of his pay grade now. And so God, has to do something here in response. Now, the way the rest of the story, goes, we know what's going on here. If we look at it in those terms, because everything that happens to Job from that point on derives from this incident, from this challenge. The Satan has just challenged God's omniscience, God's truthfulness, and God cannot let that stand. Now, he could destroy the Satan, just, blow him up, don't ever talk to me like that again, that kind of thing. But that doesn't solve the question. He could kill him off, but the question is still on the table for everybody else to wonder about. That isn't the way God's going to handle it. God says, okay, do whatever you want to him, except take his life. And the reason it's worded that way is God has to allow Satan to do everything he can to Job so that he can't come back later and complain, oh yeah, well Job would have buckled if you let me do this. No, God's leaving it wide open. Do what you want. But you're not allowed to kill him off, because then, that would become an excuse too. We all here need to know who's right and who's wrong. I'm right about Job and you're wrong. And we're going to demonstrate that. Job is going to remain alive. You can do whatever you want to him. And I'm telling you right now, I am correct. Your challenge to me, God's speaking to the Satan here, your challenge to me is going to be met. And you will be the one found wrong.
Yeah. Our translations say Satan was there.
Yeah.
It's the
Satan. The Satan.
The adversary.
One of the spiritual beings that, as we're going to see, is trying to undermine confidence in God's maintenance of cosmic order.
Yeah.
And so what God says to Satan is, hey, check out Job.
Mm-hmm.
This guy's awesome. No one like him on the land. Blameless, upright, fears God, turns away from evil. It's legit.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Satan asks, well, does Job fear you and obey your wisdom and word for no reason? Come on, you protect this guy and you bless all that he does, and now he's wealthy. So
of course he's going to be good.
Exactly. Yeah. But then the accuser or the opposer says, but how about this? Send out your hand to touch everything he has. Surely he'll curse you. And the Lord said, get behind me, Satan. That's what we wish he would have said. No, what he says is, okay, deal. Let's test the faithfulness of my servant. And he's in your power. Just don't put your hand on him himself. And so this is when the cycle of terrible things begins to happen. So really this sets up, the book is exploring both the principles of order by which God governs the cosmos. That's what the Satan is questioning. But then also by focusing mostly on Job and his internal emotional journey, it's going to focus on this question of, so if God is going to partner with humans and bless them, but in a stage of creation that's before the garden ideal is everywhere, that's going to bring moments of challenge and trust. And so do God's people love and fear him? Actually, here, I'm going to use the words of a scholar, Eric Ortland, whose excellent book on Job called Piercing Leviathan, I read not long ago. He puts the question this way. He said, the conversation between God and the Satan focus on this. Do God's people love and fear him for God's own sake? For God as the goal, as an end in himself? Or is God a means to some other end? Will any human enter into and maintain a relationship with God when the only thing to gain is God himself or God's blessings?
What does it mean to gain God himself?
Well, I think it would mean to see God and talk and relate with God in intimate union. I think that's what it would mean. If blessings are manifestations of God's generosity and goodness, then you can receive them as a gift. But wouldn't it be great to just have intimate union and connection with the giver? That would be the ultimate. So what am I after, the gifts or the giver? I think that's Eric Ortland's way of putting the question. That's certainly what the Satan is trying to raise the issue here. Do humans want to work with you, serve you, and do you want to work with them? And for what reason would they want to work? That whole thing. Okay. So this opening scene doesn't, there's so many questions that it introduces but does not answer. It's well, okay, is this how God normally makes decisions about how to work with people?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem that way. Job's clearly an exemplary kind of person.
Yeah. He doesn't seem like a realistic person in the first place.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So the portrait of Job as the innocent, suffering servant of God who suffers for no wrong that he has done and then brings all of his pain and suffering to God, seeking to just connect with God intimately to understand why, then finding deliverance from his suffering. And then he goes on to intercede for his friends so that God's mercy will be shown to his friends who are from other nation groups. And then he's restored to new life at the other end. Just that right there. And you're like, gosh, that sounds like the story of Jesus. And I think that's the function of Job within the Hebrew Bible. It's for sure one of the books that Jesus did a Bible study with at the end of Luke, about how the scriptures, about how the Messiah would suffer and then be vindicated unto life so that forgiveness could go out to the nations.
That's a bold statement. That's for sure where they went, Job.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Christians call the Old Testament, Jesus called by a number of different titles, and they played a crucial role in Jesus' upbringing. He was raised on the stories and the poems of Scripture. They had a deep, formative impact on his imagination and his sense of who he is. You can just, anytime he talks, he's just oozing lines and imagery and vocabulary from his people's scriptures, that is the Hebrew Bible. And in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, Jesus summarizes the entirety of the Hebrew Bible up into one sentence. It's really remarkable. I don't know if you've spent any time reflecting on it, but it's right here. Jesus said to his disciples, this, everything that just happened over Good Friday and Easter weekend, this is what I was telling you about while I was still with you. Everything that is written about me in the Torah of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms had to be fulfilled. This is one of Jesus' shorthand descriptions for what we call the Old Testament. And then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures, and he told them, this is what's written, and he's not quoting here, this is Jesus' summary. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. This is Jesus' summary of the message of the Old Testament. And the Old Testament includes the book of Job, doesn't it? This is Jesus' summary of the book of Job. Right. Right. How many of you have tried to read the Old Testament before? Yeah, how'd that go for you? How is that going for you? Yeah, you stick with the Psalms, right? Some of them, right? Some of them, right? Right? But it's touch and go pretty much everywhere else, Really? Okay, that's interesting. Whenever I try to read the Old Testament, it's really actually hard for me, at least it was for a very long time, for me to see that this is what it's about. Like, really? And really, there's only two options. One option is that Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about, and I suppose that's possible, but I think the odds are a lot higher that I just don't know how to read this literature, and that the questions that I bring to it are the questions that may be my questions, but they are not the questions that are going to illuminate what these texts are all about, including the book of Job. So at the risk of insulting your intelligence, I'm going to make it even more simple. Here's Jesus' summary. My clicker. Click. There we go. 3 steps. It's really simple. The Messiah. You guys with me? Here's Jesus' summary. The Messiah, which is one of many images in the Old Testament to describe a person whom God has selected and appointed for his purposes in the world, specifically to represent God to people and to represent people before God. The Messiah, God's chosen, favored one. You with me? That's step 1 of Jesus' summary. The Messiah enters into suffering and to death. But then out of death and through the other side, that Messiah is vindicated from suffering and death into resurrection life and into what Jesus says, forgiveness and good news announced to all of the nations. In Jesus' mind, it seems so simple. It's like, yeah, just read it. And that's what it's about. And for many of us, of course, that's not our experience. And this is not an idle question. This is a question that for me, as a new follower of Jesus in my early 20s, I really had a difficult time. I was so down for Jesus. He was and is so compelling and beautiful to me. And he really cared about the first 3/4 of my Bible. It's called in the table of contents, the Old Testament. But when I try and read this thing, it's talking snakes and cosmic floods, lots of sex scandals and violence and ancient poetry. And it's like, what does this have to do with anything? Anybody? Do you know what I'm talking about? So this, a normal person would be like, okay, well, I'll just deal with the Psalms and read the stories about Jesus, and I'll call it good at that. I took the other course of becoming obsessed with it and went to school for much longer than any reasonable person should, and learning lots of ancient languages because for one reason or another, the way I'm wired, this has become one of the driving questions of my whole life. What is Jesus talking about? I want to know what Jesus saw when he read the book of Job. I want to hear from Job what he heard from Job, because the book of Job is about a guy who suffers, and somehow how that suffering is woven into the mysterious purpose of God. And I think that's a really important thing to know what Jesus thought about, because it clearly informed like so much of what he did. I want to hear from Job what Jesus heard from Job. And what Jesus says he heard from Job is this. Are you with me? So let's just, as a thought experiment, let's just think about the story of Job from this summary. And you know what's really fascinating is that it works really well. Like really, my clicker, this might be a problem. It's going to be a problem for me. I'll just say next slide for the next ones, Corin. You know what's interesting? Job like fits the pattern like to a T. It begins with God's righteous, chosen, favored one, blessed, right? Are you with me? I mean, it's actually, remember, the book has a 3-part structure. Prologue, dialogues, and epilogue. The prologue is all about highlighting Job's righteousness and his innocence before God. And yet, this righteous one that God calls his servant is handed over to unjust suffering, near death, huge outcry of protest and lament. And after all of that lament is complete, God vindicates his righteous servant, restores his life, and restores him to a place of blessing, and forgives his friends, who, interestingly enough, are from all the surrounding nations. Anybody? Well, that's interesting.
Now let's go back there. This is sort of like the Elohim discussion. We have been taught, for some reason, again, it's just tradition, that somehow we get unnerved by the thought that we don't have the devil in Job 1 and 2 because we've always been taught that. And we get unnerved by the observation that's very simple to confirm. Just the serpent is never called Satan. Well, that must mean there's a contradiction. No, you know what it means? It means that biblical writers are under no obligation to use the same words to describe the same guy. Where's the cosmic rule that says every time we talk about anti-Eden or the undoing of Eden or death that we have to use the word Satan or the word serpent? Who made up that rule? Why is it that we have to use the same vocabulary in all these passages? Is there a cosmic rule that says we can't come up with other terms to refer to the same rebel over the course of time that fit, that aptly describe him? This is actually what you see in the Second Temple period texts. The rebel of Eden, Genesis 3, the supernatural one, gets called a number of things in between the Testaments. He does get called Satan there. It starts to be used as a proper name. This is when we have the transition outside the Hebrew Bible. But then it takes the form of mastema. Again, I'm not going to bore you with Hebrew noun formation. I mean, that would put you out, okay? But you take satam, which is a related word to satan, to oppose. When you want to make it a noun, you put an M in front of it. So we have mastema. Okay, that becomes a title in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's used. Belial, the worthless one. That's not an Old Testament term. We can't call the rebel of Genesis 3 Belial because there's a cosmic rule that says we can only use the word Satan. Really? Why? Again, there is no rule like that. So we have mastema, we have Belial. Beliar is a derivative. We have Beelzebul, which is actually a really interesting one. Beelzebul is Canaanite. Baal is Baal. Zebul is the word for prince. Okay, Baal becomes sort of a primary source figure for Satan imagery. Why? Because Baal is Lord of the dead in Canaanite religion. He also thinks he's the ruler of the nations. Prince Baal. I mean, the Gospels refer to the devil, to Satan, as Beelzebul. This is why. Diabolos, devil, the deceiver, the liar, the slanderer, more literally. Okay, all of these terms fit. If the shoe fits, let's let him wear them. And Satan in Greek doesn't have the rule about the definite article. You can have ha, like ha Jesus. It's not the Jesus, it's just Jesus. Right? Greek tolerates a definite article in front of a proper personal name. Hebrew does not, just like English. Languages are different. So by the time you get into the Greek-speaking world, which is in between the Testaments, the Hellenistic period, I hate to bring up history of Civ because you all wanted to forget that in high school as soon as you had it. But the Hellenistic era is a big deal. The world becomes Greek-speaking. And with that, the language has more elasticity. And so Satanas can become a proper personal name in a Greek-speaking world, and it does. And since the New Testament's written in Greek, they use that. This is all you have. You don't have a contradiction between the Testaments. You have a supernatural rebel in Genesis 3 that brings the ruination of Eden and death and estrangement from God, and over time he gets called lots of things. They're all appropriate. That's it. But again, if I was a religion teacher at a typical undergraduate institution, and I have a bunch of Christians in my Religion 101 class, oh, I can't wait to talk about this. In 60 minutes, I'm going to have you thinking your Bible is ridiculous and full of contradictions. I'm going to give you textual dilemmas like this, and I'm not going to unpack them for you at all, because I want to destroy your faith. This is easy. Don't get the impression that every professor of religion or biblical studies that isn't a Christian is like this. They're not. Most of them are apathetic toward issues of faith. I mean, they're not there to intentionally harm people, but there are some that are. They live for it. I have met them. They are out there. And the solution to this, again, is to teach people, especially, high school and stuff like this, to get them ready for these kinds of things that they're going to have in their religion class. Because what a coincidence, they're forced to take this class. Oh, who would have thought that? Well, again, there's an agenda here. So I probably got a little far afield with that, but there is a role for that, and there is a logic as to why this one gets elevated in terms of the understanding that you get in the New Testament, but it's not directly linked to the scene in Job 1 and 2.
Look at what happens next in the story. I think it's next slide. This is Job chapter 42. After the Lord said these things to Job, he, that is the Lord, said to Eliphaz, this is one of Job's friends, the Temanite, dude, I'm so angry at you and your two friends, because you haven't spoken the truth about me. You wrapped me in your theological formulas. You love to talk about me. You love to talk about me. But you haven't spoken the truth about me like Job has. Job is the only character in the book who talks to God. Job is the one who actually utters what you would say could be the most possibly heretical statements about God in the book. And God's not angry about that at all. What he says is, here's somebody who knows how to tell the truth. Are you with me? And Job's the only person in the book who poured all of his despair, all of his anger, all of his confusion before God, and talks to God and comes to a place of trust and surrender. And watch what happens the moment that Job reaches that place. Verse 8, so now, Eliphaz, go take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job is going to pray for you, and I will accept his prayer. I won't deal with you according to your folly, because you didn't tell the truth about me. Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, I don't know why it's funny to say their names, they did what the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer, and then he's restored. Notice that Job is still suffering when he utters his prayer. When God's righteous servant is willing to surrender everything and go into suffering that is unjust and undeserved, and cry out on behalf of the many before God, God hears the prayer of his righteous servant, and forgiveness is released to the nations. Notice that all of the nations that his 3 friends are from are highlighted right at that moment in the story. Are you guys with me? So the book of Job is not designed to answer our questions about the problem of evil. The book of Job is designed to do what the whole of the Hebrew Bible is designed to do, which is not to give us an answer, an intellectual answer that we can tuck in our pockets and walk away feeling good about the world, because we shouldn't be feeling good about the world. We live outside of Eden, you guys. It sucks out here. We're dying. You're dying. Do you know that? I'm dying. It's terrible, actually. It's not okay what happens out here. And, all the ways that we anesthetize ourselves, with our devices and creature comforts, and it's just, the book of Job is trying to shake us awake. The world's not okay. But man, what if, here outside of Eden, we had somebody who would stare down the worst of human pain and suffering and maintain their integrity and surrender their lives before God? Man, what if someone like that came along? The last sentence of the book of Job is that he dies. And you're like, okay, well, I thought it was going to be him. But, right, if anybody was going to do it, it'd be the book of Job. And the melody continues. Are you tracking with me? When Jesus talked about the book of Job, he wasn't just talking about an interesting set of stories about the past. And he wasn't just summarizing like, hey, isn't this cool, this thing I just did over, Passover weekend here in Jerusalem. It just happens to match one or two prophecies in the Old Testament. What he's saying is that the whole thing's about him. Like the whole thing is about him. Job is Jesus. Are you tracking with me? And what I mean when I say that is Job is one among the whole mosaic of characters in the Hebrew Bible that is trying to tell us what's wrong with the world, about what's wrong with us, about the kind of place that we're living in, and what's the way out here. And every cycle of the melody just keeps focusing in on one solution. Man, if we just had one human who actually didn't listen to the snake, who actually didn't give in to the desires and the creature comforts that get us all to compromise and redefine good and evil by our own wisdom and in our own eyes. Man, what if someone like that came along? And it's like the Hebrew Bible gives you the silhouette, and Jesus of Nazareth just walks right into it. That's what he's saying. And so this summary right here, it doesn't just summarize the book of Job. It's actually the life of Jesus. And this is the next slide, and I'll end with this. Just think through the story of Jesus with me. All four of the Gospels present Jesus to us as God's chosen, favored, anointed one, his righteous and blameless one. At Jesus' baptism, Jesus is marked as God's blameless, chosen Messiah. What's the very next thing that happens in all of the Gospel accounts? Jesus is led into the wilderness. By whom? Who takes Jesus into the wilderness where he begins to suffer? The Spirit. And what's really interesting is that when the Spirit brings Jesus on purpose into a period of suffering, we're like, yeah, go Jesus. Like, do it on my behalf, please. But when God brings Job into suffering on behalf of his arrogant friends so that his prayer can cover for their sins, we're like, that's not fair. Are you with me? But it's the same thing.
The book of Job never says what any of us quite want it to say.
What do we want it to say?
What we want to say is, I'll kill the dragon, Job. There was some purpose for which you suffered that will be revealed to you one day. I mean, he never hears any of it. He never learns about the conversation with the accuser. So the reader, we know that there's some test. This is a test of God's righteous servant, whether he will suffer in trust.
And he passes the test by recognizing what?
By recognizing that he shouldn't have accused God of mismanagement, accused God of being a moral monster. He should have trusted that there was some reason, even if it was beyond his reason. But the book, even the author of Job, doesn't give us what the reason is. Like the conversations with the Satan at the beginning don't tell you what the reason was. Just tell you that God decided it was okay to test Job.
Well, the reason was to see if Job was in it for a relationship with God or for the blessing.
Yes. And the fact that Job, throughout his speeches, eventually just ends up talking to God. He just pursues God. In a way, it's even in his
that's interesting.
Frustration with God, it drove him closer to God.
I see. And it proves that he was actually in it for God.
For God. Because his last request is, if I could just see God and talk to him.
Okay, hold on.
The book of Job the book of Job's session through the melody doesn't foreground and highlight the hostile one's role in the suffering of all of creation. There's other cycles of the melody that really focus on that. And Job is really focused on the internal processing of God's righteous servant as he goes through suffering to intercede for the many. But if we take the whole cycle of the biblical story, and this is what I was trying to get at, I think the one that Jesus was angry at was not God. It was that freaking snake. That snake. That's the one that Jesus was angry at. And so if I'm going to adopt Jesus' view of why the world is the way that it is, It means recognizing that we live outside of Eden, and outside of Eden, we are all destined for the dust of death and for suffering. In this world, you will have trouble, and please don't expect anything else, I think is what Jesus is trying to say. Except we get these moments, these little gifts of Eden, in the form of a friendship, in the form of a good meal, in the form of laughter with a friend, in the form of a gift of healing, in the form of ways that God speaks to us through. Are you guys with me? Yeah. These little Eden gifts that we get outside of Eden in the wilderness. And it seems to me that Jesus really saw the suffering and evil in his world as a result of this huge cascade of cause and effect, all leading back to the lies of the snake. And I have to imagine that based on his words and his teachings, that's what he believed, and that's what carried him through the wilderness, through all of those nights in agony and prayer, knowing that the priests had a plan to murder him. I mean, just imagine trying to sleep through the night knowing that there's someone who wants to murder you. Like, I've never had that experience. And Jesus walked around with that. That was his daily lived experience for like a long time. Like, what carried him through? And I'm just certain it wasn't a suspicion of God's character. I'm certain that it was a hatred for the snake, and knowing that he was doing exactly what God was calling him to do, to overcome the snake through his death and resurrection. And so what does it mean for us to process that? I want to come to a place where the suffering that happens to my life and that happens to the people that I love and that's happening, the stuff that came out, this week about what's happened in Ukraine over the last few weeks and all these civilian deaths, right? And we're all like shocked that this is how humans treat each other. And man, the longer I sit with the Hebrew Bible, and it's like, why would I expect anything different? Like, this is what humans always do to each other. And if I happen to think that this is not how humans treat each other, it's because I'm the delusional one, right? And this is what happens every day in every human community, through all of human history, across the whole planet. In this world, you will have trouble. I shouldn't expect anything else. And it's not God's fault if I'm taking up the mind of Jesus, I think. It's the snake's fault. And what God is doing something through Jesus and the work of his Spirit to reunite heaven and earth. And I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. But what I'm trying to say, and this is my nerdy way of doing it, but it's just who I am. It's just my temperament. But I'm thinking personally and pastorally. When suffering crashes into our lives, we go to these default modes of processing our life experience. And they're not the modes that you consciously think about. They're the ones that are deeply ingrained within us. And so it seems to me what apprenticeship to Jesus means is somehow beginning a set of habits and practices in my life where that new narrative that is Jesus' story becomes my new second native language for how I process suffering in my life. And I want to get to a place where when suffering happens to my life and the people that I care about, where I'm not suspicious of God, but God becomes the only place that I know to go. And where my anger is directed is at that freaking snake. Are you with me? I want to get to that place. I'm not there. And I don't fully know why I'm not there. But all I can say is that I've been formed by other stories about suffering and why the world is the way that it is that are not how Jesus would tell the story.
But Jesus trusted in God's power to create new life on the other side of chaos and death. And he called his followers to confront the dragon in the same way.
Which means
resist the temptation to use the violent, destructive ways of the dragon. And also, don't be afraid of it. Jesus' victory over the beast has created a way to escape its power. And trust in the power of God, who will one day defeat the dragon once and for all.
If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, share, turn on the alerts for this channel.
All those things help us get the message out about what God has done for this world. And we're so excited to have you here along for the journey. This is a community, and I've loved having all the response and all the connection that I've had with you guys across the globe. So thankful you're here. Tune in. Stay tuned, as we always say. The beginning is near. We've got more coming. See you soon.